Is there a democratic deficit at the heart of the European Union? The European Union consists of three different institutions: the European Commission, the European Parliament, and the European Council. The Commission is made up of heads of governments from member states, and it proposes legislation, sets priorities, and acts as a guardian of the treaties. The European Parliament consists of elected members of European Parliament, or MEPs, who act as a legislative body representing the people. There are currently 751 MEPs, 73 of those being from the UK. The Council of the European Union is a legislative body that represents the states comprised of government ministers. The concern of unelected individuals and apparent lack of accountability is what fuels the anti-Europeans' idea that there is a lack of democracy within the EU. The role of the European Union is constantly enlarging, taking on more powers and responsibility, which means they are increasingly involved in more areas of policy, as well as increasing the amount of integration as there are further transfers of sovereignty from nation-states to the EU. It is argued as to whether this enlargement of the EU's powers is democratic or not. Some people believe that member states have essentially agreed to this increased role and powers of the EU in a succession of signed treaties. However, due to the disputed immense powers of each of the European institutions, there are concerns that they have too much power. Eurosceptic parties have been increasingly popular throughout Europe, such as UKIP in the UK, gaining 3.8 million votes in the 2015 general election, the Danish People's Party, the National Front in France, and the Finns Party, amongst many others. With a total of 63 nationalist parties of the 28 member states, their popularity is now greater than ever due to an increasing skepticism and lack of trust many citizens harbour towards the European Union. Elite domination within the EU is a disputed issue due to the alarming lack of influence member states appear to have in important decision-making, namely treaties. For example, the Danes rejected the Maastricht Treaty in 1992 in a referendum, only to be asked a year later to accept a very similar treaty. The Irish rejected the Nice Treaty in 2001 in a referendum, only for another one to be called later in the year. In addition, the EU endeavoured to introduce an EU constitution. This was agreed by the heads of governments in 2004, but rejected by the French and Dutch voters in a 2005 referendum. After this desperate attempt to implement a constitution that multiple member states didn't want, the EU brought it back in 2008, but had rebranded it as the Lisbon Treaty. There has been research to show that the EU Constitution and the Lisbon Treaty are 92% identical. Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, former French president and president of the Constitutional Convention, said that the Treaty of Lisbon is the same as the rejected constitution, only the format has been changed to avoid referendums. Italian Prime Minister and current Internal Affairs Minister Giuliano Amato also agreed with this proclamation, stating that the constitution had deliberately been made illegible for citizens, precisely in order to avoid referendums. These are prime examples of the elite domination of the European Union and how, despite the use of a facade on equal democratic decision-making, unwanted policy is still pushed through regardless. However, this elite domination does not only reside within the European Union, it was also present in the entire Brexit campaign as the economic elite used persuasive methods to influence the public's collective verdict. The entire Remain campaign concentrated heavily on the economy, and cues from the elite, politicians and the media were big determiners for EU support. Big businesses funded the Remain campaign as, leaving the EU, Britain could lose its passporting rights and membership to the single market. The single market is a body which allows tariff barriers to be removed, thereby lessening the cost of trade around Europe, producing long-term economic benefits and encouraging greater prosperity, competition and choice for businesses. Passporting rights allow British-based financial institutions to operate their businesses in the wider European economic area, whilst being regulated by UK authorities. Depending on the exit arrangement after Brexit, these rights may no longer exist, and financial organisations wanting to continue to provide services across the EEA may have to undergo the costly process of establishing a subsidiary within the EEA country. Along with big businesses, every institution, main party and head of government told the British public to vote Remain. In fact, all parties except UKIP were in favour of remaining. This even included the Treasury, as they issued a report stating that every household would be £4,000 worse off if Britain were to leave the EU. Barack Obama held a speech to promote the Remain campaign. However, it has since become apparent that his speech was written for him by the British government, as he warned that the UK would be at the back of the queue in any trade deal with the US if the country chose to leave the EU, with queue being a purely British expression. This was all part of a collective conspiracy in favour of the undemocratic European Union, and was part of a long-term aim of global governance at the expense of sovereign states. The Leave campaign was mainly led by UKIP, a protest party who represented the Left Behinds, dissatisfied with the political class and elitists, and the EU referendum gave these people a platform to demonstrate their distrust and disapproval. However, the democratic deficit is largely exaggerated by Eurosceptics, especially regarding the Leave campaign for Brexit. It's argued that the EU is growing to be more powerful, legitimate, and assertive. Along with this, the EU is using its power for better use. The EU has taken on multinational giants like Microsoft, Samsung, and Toshiba for unfair competition. The UK would not be able to do this alone. The single market allows for a wider choice of products and services and provides a huge potential market for businesses. Being in the EU creates economic growth and more jobs for British workers, and trade with the EU accounts for 44% of UK exports. In the EU single market, over 1 million UK businesses trade without export or import charges or paperwork, to 500 million customers in the EU. As a result of Brexit, businesses would now be hit by new charges to trade goods or services in the EU, leading to job cuts, higher prices, lower wages, and fewer job opportunities for UK citizens. Companies say they would move their business and jobs to other EU countries, meaning fewer jobs on the UK market. In 2007, the European Commission published a report from an independent organisation stating the European economy has grown more than 2% since 1992, which means greater prosperity for member states and their inhabitants. The Governor of the Bank of England says Brexit would lead to an economic shock or recession, which would mean dramatic public spending cuts, job losses, and years of financial insecurity for British families. The aftermath of Brexit, thus far, proves that the European Union was a positive body that did not take our sovereignty, rather it provided us with great economic benefits. The idea of pooled sovereignty is the notion that the whole is greater than the sum of the part, of which most pro-Europeans believe to be the case with member states in the EU. Pooling your sovereignty would mean countries are stronger together, and rather than the EU being an elite domination, is instead a collective democratic body comprising of equally heard member states rather than what the Leave campaign claimed were unelected bureaucrats. The European Union is not the only regional organisation in existence. A comparison with the less legitimate bodies such as the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization and the Organization of American States would show that the EU allows for the participation of millions of people in direct elections, unlike most other organizations. The Maastricht Treaty introduced the co-decision-making procedure, later renamed the Ordinary Legislative Procedure under the Lisbon Treaty, which means no legislation can pass without the approval from Parliament and Council, and 80% of new policy is decided under this, thereby making the European Parliament more powerful. While there have been referendums in member states regarding proposed EU treaties, normally the ends result in an extremely close call, and if considering most turnouts, would likely not be a democratic decision. When deciding as to whether to adopt the Maastricht Treaty, 51% of the Danish population voted against, whereas 49% of the population voted for, which is hardly a drastic solid outcome. The ultimate decision, only being advisory, could have swung either way, depending on the government at the time. Similarly, with the Irish referendum, 53% voted against and 46% voted for, both of which are not largely radical conclusions. An example of the supposed democratic deficit of the European Union is shown in one of the EU's major bodies, the European Commission. This body is the executive of the EU and is a powerful organisation. Therefore, there are democratic concerns from anti-Europeans who worry it is too powerful and not democratic enough. Its power threatens the sovereignty of member states, and it is argued that the Commission is unelected and unaccountable, as there aren't enough checks or limitations on their power. The Commission acts as a law unto itself, as each head of government from each country appoints a commissioner, and they are almost guaranteed to get the job. The European Parliament has de jure sovereignty as to who becomes a commissioner, but de facto their elections make very little difference as to who is in the Commission. For example, Tony Blair appointed Peter Mandelson to be a commissioner, however they were political allies. Being ideologically and personally close, it was seen as an undemocratic practice, especially since the commissioners' positions are so secure. Once commissioners are appointed, they are difficult to remove. They hold their posts for 5 years, and the only leverage any of the EU bodies have over them is the Parliament can fire the Commission as a whole, but not as individuals. Even with this power, they are unlikely to fire a whole Commission solely due to one person's actions. For example, Edith Cresson was a French commissioner from 1995 to 1999 who wanted to create an EU youth training program. She was given millions to fund the scheme, however it was unsuccessful, but the money had disappeared as there were no checks on the use of the money. The careless commissioner, as she was better known as, then was put in charge of an EU-wide strategy to tackle the AIDS epidemic. She had appointed her dentist to work alongside her on a full salary despite his lack of qualifications. For this, she was only prosecuted after she had left office, and not once were the Commission fired for her actions, nor was she held accountable throughout that time. Commissioners can abuse their powers and have become out of touch with public opinion, pushing European ideas that no one really wants. Another example of this is Nelly Kroes tax dodging by being the director of a company in the Bahamas from 2000 to 2009. According to the European Commission's Code of Conduct, it's prohibited and she had formally violated this. While she was a commissioner from 2004 to 2014, she was, again, never prosecuted until after she had left office, and the only sanction against former commissioners is the loss of their pension. The Commission has a major role when it comes to new legislation and policy, as it has the power of initiative, meaning it proposes and formulates all new policy and legislation. Before, the Council of Ministers had a veto on their decisions, however it is now almost gone due to the introduction of QMV, which has drastically reduced member states' influence within the main EU institutions. Qualified majority voting is used in 80% of legislation. Previously, with the veto, only one state would need to oppose the legislation for it to be blocked. However, it now requires a group of states which is a blocking minority, so most of the Commission's legislation will go through to decision-making in the Council and Parliament, which has a detrimental impact on member states with a lower population who have less influence when it comes to QMV, as they need more states to back up their decision of a blocking minority, as all EU legislation will inevitably bear its mark. This can allow unnecessary and ridiculous laws to be made and implemented across Europe, including the limitation on balloon usage. According to EU rules from 1988, all children under the age of 8 cannot use latex balloons without a supervising parent, and text on the latex balloons must have such a warning on them. Another example is the banning of halogen light bulbs. Widely unpopular EU regulations has restricted the sale of incandescent light bulbs because they were not seen as energy efficient enough. Their more energy efficient replacements, LED and fluorescent bulbs, give off a colder, more unnatural light. The Commission Regulation 225794 required that bananas be free from malformation and abnormal curvature, showing that food products are over-regulated. Since records began, the UK has not managed to prevent a single proposal placed in front of the Council from becoming European law. This amounts to 55 measures that the UK has opposed since 1996, but have gone on to become British law regardless. The UK's representation in all of the EU bodies has declined dramatically. Since 1973, the UK's voting power in the Council of Ministers has decreased from 17% to 8%. In the European Parliament, it has decreased from 20% to 9.5%, and in the Commission, it has decreased from 15% to 4%. The European Commission is part of a democratic system, therefore it should not be a problem for them to listen to people and take criticisms. However, the Commission is not very democratic. It is out of touch as it is highly centralized in Brussels bureaucracy. For example, workers are given unnecessary rights in the workplace, which makes businesses too expensive and competitive, as it increases the costs of businesses competing with those outside of Europe who won't be at the same disadvantages. This was a driving force for small businesses to leave the EU, as it's less expensive and more efficient without unnecessary rights. For example, rest periods, unnecessary health and safety policy, holiday pay, and paternity leave. In addition, part-time workers and agency workers get the same rights as full-time workers even if they hadn't worked there for very long. However, the Commission doesn't want regulation swept away and wants to create more as it justifies its existence. Günther Verheugen wanted to reduce legislation and deregulate the EU industry but didn't succeed. This is because of EU mandarins, and his own civil servants blocked his attempts, stating, "The more rules you produce, the more Europe you have." Current President of the European Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker, said something very similar to that in his State of the Union speech. European Union still does not have enough union. The European Commission isn't entirely as undemocratic as Eurosceptics may make it out to be. In addition, QMV's purpose is not to use it, but rather to know it's there, as it allows for negotiations leading to compromise. Even so, important changes like treaty law require unanimity, and 20% of all policy decisions made within the Council are still done on a unanimity basis, giving each state a veto to protect their national interest. This is in areas such as tax harmonization, policy and judicial cooperation, and EU foreign policy. For example, Poland initially vetoed the EU prisoner transfer scheme, so were then given a 5-year delay in their participation. States cannot always prevent arrangements they're not in favour of, but this isn't necessarily a bad thing, nor undemocratic. It would be undemocratic for one state to prevent something that every other state wants to happen. QMV therefore reduces the possibility of individual states having too much power. Weighted majority voting is a compromise between simple majority and unanimity. For example, Hungary had a referendum as to whether it would comply with the EU refugee policy with an outcome of paralysis, meaning no migrants will receive refuge. Showing tyranny of the minority could lead to political gridlock. The Commission's large decision-making power is mostly accurate, but 70% of all MEPs' amendments to proposed legislation are adopted by the Commission and agreed by the Council. The Commission is now far more accountable. For example, the Santer Commission resignation in 1999 due to their failure to tackle fraud. They had resigned when they found out that Parliament was going to fire them. This was seen as a landmark in the shift of power between the Commission and the Parliament. It shows that the Commission is not autonomous, but an executive under the authority of the legislative. The European Parliament always had a responsibility to carry out a vetting role in regards to new commissioners. This, however, was always seen as a formality, as no one was ever rejected, and the non-controversial hearings were more of a getting-to-know-you procedure. This was until Rocco Buttiglione, appointed by Italian Prime Minister Silvio Berlusconi, was given the Justice, Freedom and Security role by the President of the European Commission at the time, José Manuel Barroso. Buttiglione was a right-wing nationalist and was proven to be homophobic and sexist. But instead of allowing this, Parliament threatened to reject the whole Commission. This happened again in 2010 with Bulgaria, as Romania Jeleva was chosen as their first commissioner. Parliament believed she was unsuitable for post due to complete lack of knowledge. She then resigned from politics completely. In conclusion, the democratic deficit of the EU is largely exaggerated and the contributing cause to nationalist parties and to Brexit. However, when looking at the scope of things, the EU is only improving, especially since it's the only international organisation of its kind to have such direct participation, and in comparison is the most democratic international organisation. It's unfair to compare its success with that of individual member states, when it's a much larger body. I personally believe that you could focus on the failings of any European body and say that it's undemocratic as a whole, but in the bigger picture, its success has only been increasing in recent years with its enlargement and integration.